So friends, thank you again so much for joining us for our Good Futures webinar. Today, I'm going to be talking through a little bit more about the Good Futures Accelerator process and give you all a chance to get a deep dive into the Accelerator. We're going to go over bits of the process, how the Accelerator works, show you a little bit about what the curriculum looks like, and then share some stories about how some of our churches have used the Accelerator in the past. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Mark Sampson, who will give a little bit of a history of RootedGood and the Accelerator.
Thanks, Tito. My name is Mark Sampson. I'm one of the co-founders of RootedGood. And RootedGood is an organization that has, it's birthed in relationships and experience. So Shannon and I have been working together, Shannon Hopkins and I, for probably a decade or so now. Originally in London, where my accent comes from. And I more recently reside here in Michigan in the US. And we're doing increasing amounts of work here around the intersection of faith and social enterprise. We'll unpack social enterprise a bit more later. And I joined a colleague and fellow co-founder, Mark Elsden, about 4 years ago to start the next chapter of our work together called RootedGood. And at RootedGood, we are really interested and compelled by responding to the challenge of the different factors that are affecting churches right now as it relates to their economic model, the impact they're having in their community, and how they respond to the opportunities that are latent within their physical assets, their properties and their buildings. And we're creating resources and processes to help churches respond to the challenge and opportunity presented by this situation. We're going to unpack various aspects of this, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague Shannon, who's going to talk to us about why good futures and why now.
Hi, thanks, Mark. Yeah, so at RootedGood, we have designed the Good Futures Accelerator, and I hope that you've been on our website and looked around a little bit. But the question, right, why good futures and why now? Well, we know that the landscape of the church in America is changing, right? There, you know, are up to 4,000 to 6,000 churches closing a year. Churches are redeveloping. Churches are finding new ways to do mission. This is, in some ways, a new moment for the church. And we know that we don't church like we did in the 1950s or the 1980s, and that's putting some pressure on congregations in local communities. But we at RootedGood see it as an opportunity. This is a moment for the church to discover new economic models, new ways of fulfilling their mission, and doing it in new economic ways in their community. So that's why Good Futures. It's like, this is a tool to help the church rise to this moment. We've made this curriculum self-paced and self-guided because we believe that that churches can determine their future and their community. You can actually do the work. You don't need someone from the outside to say, this is what you should do. So we create the process that allows a congregation to have good questions and see what's possible in their community. So that's why Good Futures, why now?
So about 3 years ago, we created a pilot version of Good Futures, which was called Oikos back then, to try and help congregations do three things: to generate new forms of revenue, to use their buildings and land in new ways, and most importantly, number one, fulfill their sense of mission and calling and purpose in their local communities. And so we create a process to help churches start projects that would achieve all three things: revenue, buildings and land in new ways, and mission, centered and focused on mission and purpose. And we did it in the midst of COVID. We did it in the midst of the challenges of the struggles and stress of that time, the communication being, we shifted to an online process. And we were really wondering, because of that, what transformation could take place in congregations if there's no one in the room to help them, if they're self-directed, if they have materials and processes, but they can kind of get through that on their own. And we were delighted with what happened. And that gave us all the encouragement we needed to shift in this last year and revise the curriculum and package it for a new experience. Of the congregations that were in the pilot, 97% said it was helpful in helping them see new possibilities for how their property can further their mission. And 88% said it was very or extremely helpful in doing so. Again, 95% said that this pilot was very or extremely helpful in seeing new possibilities for how their property can generate new revenue streams. So people were beginning to think this way, to learn this way about seeing their buildings and land with new eyes. Very, very quickly, some of the stories that came through were fascinating. We have everything from small projects in the pilot of, a church that has a commercial kitchen, and it created a space for food entrepreneurs in the local community that were from low-income neighborhoods to create a space where they can incubate and grow and start food businesses. All the way up to, a church in Campbell in California that's looking at doing a very large affordable housing project across multiple units, because affordable housing is the greatest need in their local community. We have people experimenting with community land trusts. We have a fantastic church on the Gulf Shore in Alabama that's opened a business center. And there's a few stories about that church in the media recently. So lots of different kinds of projects, lots of different approaches, because it's very contextual, very much about the community, about the buildings and land the church has. But the process was designed to get them to this idea and get them the confidence to get started. At the root of this is this phrase, social enterprise. And that really just comes from a bunch of folk in the last 30 or 40 years, particularly, that have begun using revenue generating activities, right, which are normally, been historically just in the commercial business space, but using those in more the sort of social sector. So using revenue generating activities to achieve sort of social purposes, to achieve community transformation. And really what we're trying to do is bring some of that skill, some of our experience as founders in doing that work over the years, into this question of how churches can fulfill their mission in new ways, use their buildings and land in new ways, and generate new forms of revenue.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. So now that we've gotten a sense of how Good Futures has come into the world today, I'd like to spend some time to dive into the process of Good Futures, how the accelerator is built, give you a little bit of insight into the pedagogy. So I'm going to ask my colleague Angela Johnson, I think, to pull up our slides. And then Mark, if you wouldn't mind, could you tell us a little bit more about what the process is like for our churches that are participating in the Good Futures Accelerator? What does going through the curriculum look like?
Yes, so this is a multimodal learning experience, which is a very sort of long-winded way of saying it uses lots of different things. It's based on a kind of pedagogy or understanding of what we call sort of cluster-based learning. So there are 7 main sessions, and each of the session has these big table sheets that you see on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen there. These fold out onto a table, and a team of sort of, sits around this and goes through this process together. There's 7 different sessions. We'll unpack what the different parts of that journey are later on. Each of these sessions, before these sessions, the different folk in the team will go through some pre-work. So we have a Good Futures workbook. You can see that on the bottom left. This just has some stories, some stuff to unpack, some pre-works. Maybe you go and talk to some folk in the community. You have a look at your buildings. You come up with some different stories you want to share. So you come ready to that sort of group session to think together about how you're going to go through that part of the curriculum. When you get to the group session, you sit around the table sheet and you start by watching a video. So each course starts with a video that kind of unpacks some of the ideas behind that session. And then it moves into going through the materials. So some of it, you play a bit of a game, you read some stories, but it all leads to you making key decisions at that part in your journey towards coming up with your idea. And there's lots of different ways that you can kind of get involved in different manners. We'll unpack a bit more of that later, but we create a process. So there's individuals involved, there's a team involved, and there's ways to draw in the wider congregation with a few key activities, because we've learned, and you guys all know this working with churches, that you have to bring everybody with you. These processes need to be broad in the sense of kind of buy-in and ownership, as well as deep. And so we're trying to do both of those with this particular approach to curriculum.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. And I know some question that we often get from folks that are interested in the Good Futures Accelerator is how does the wider congregation get involved in the process? So I know, from what you're saying, the Good Futures Accelerator is really meant for this core team, sometimes from 3 to 5 members from a team, from a congregation. So what are some opportunities for this core team to get to the wider congregation involved in the process?
Yeah, so there's three main ways that we've created, but we also encourage churches to come up with other ways to do this as well. The 3 ways we created is there's a game that some of you have played, I know, on this call, called Mission Possible. That's probably one of our most well-known tools that we've created. And it's an interactive, fun game that can work with large numbers of people. We've played it with up to 120 in one time. And it's a game that teaches the process of creativity, particularly of an approach to creativity called design thinking. So how do you create a potential solution to a challenging problem in an hour and a half? We give you funny resources to use. There's a process. You end up pitching your idea to the room. And it's a fun, simple process that just gets you thinking about the creative process, and particularly how that can work with teams and how it can work when there's constraints about resources. So that's one of the things. So you get that in the box. You get 2 books in the box as well. So our colleague Mark Elsden, the other co-founder for RootedGood, has written 2 books. The first, We Aren't Broke, looks at how churches often have a scarcity mindset about resources, but actually we have so much. And the question is, how do we use those well in pursuit of our mission? And then much more recently, just in the beginning of this year, this fantastic book, Gone for Good, emerged on the shelves. And it's a compendium of essays around this issue of the transition of church property. So as Shannon mentioned earlier, we're seeing large numbers of church properties sold every year, could be potentially up to about 100,000 by the year 2030 in the US alone. And this book explores that from multiple dynamics, looking at it from the question of the pastor, the theologian, from the property developer, from the city, from the zoning and planning perspective, from the environmental perspective, from a rural perspective, from the perspective of indigenous communities, all exploring what's at stake here when churches close, and what ways can we imagine that there might be a different future. So those books are going to be part of this accelerator. And alongside that, there's 2 other opportunities. One is a very simple tool called I Spy. And this sits just before the session, where you look at your local community and what the needs and opportunities, the strengths and challenges are in your local community. And this is a simple tool where you walk around the neighborhood and you meet people, you ask questions, you observe, you listen, you watch, and you just begin really doing that deep community listening together to identify what's happening. And then finally, the last way that you can get people involved is a kind of, we call it the discovery labyrinth. And this is when you walk around all of your buildings and land, and you basically look at each of the places, you tell stories about what's happened in each space in the past, and you create a bit of space to share what you're missing, what used to happen there that you wish happened, but then to break from that and look to the future. Okay, what could happen here? And so you can, walk through every space. So many churches have fed back to us that most people have never been in every room or every area or walked on every bit of land, or didn't realize we had this, that's ours, what? And so it's a fascinating uncovering of what kinds of building and land do you have? What kind of opportunities are latent or hidden perhaps within what you have? So those are 4 simple ways you can draw in the wider congregation. As you said, as we said earlier, we really encourage pastors and other leaders, lay leaders, to find other ways of reaching out, of telling the congregation, the wider congregation, where you're at in the journey, what you're learning, what's sort of working well, what's frustrating. You're bringing people on board because we see that as such a crucial component in getting some good ideas off the ground.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark, so much. So just to kind of recap a little bit of what's going on, and to give you an idea of what the entire journey of the Good Futures Accelerator looks like. For churches that are purchasing the Good Futures Accelerator, each church, what it comes with is a set of video curriculum, and as well as a welcome box, which comes with all of the physical materials needed to conduct the accelerator that Mark just mentioned for us. The accelerator, we estimate, takes approximately 7 to 9 months to complete. We know that some churches might complete this faster or may need to take a little bit more time. Another word of advice that we often say is that we don't recommend that churches start this during the Advent season, as we know that sometimes it can be hard to convene people around that time. But so the accelerator walks each congregation through the process of using the skills of design thinking towards developing a social enterprise, using their assets, buildings, and land. And so here on the screen right now, you can see a little bit of what that journey looks like. Most churches that conduct the accelerator will often hold their group sessions once a month. And so they'll give that time for their group to complete that pre-work activity, to then come together, watch that video, and then do the table sheet or group activity. And so this will walk you through introducing the process of the accelerator, showing you how to discover the people and passions within your congregation and the surrounding community, and then diving deep a little bit more into what your community looks like using our tools like I Spy and some community interviews. This process continues where you're then mapping your space, getting an idea of what is utilized and what isn't utilized in your church building and land. Once you have that context, you'll then, as a team, come together to start gathering ideas of what a social enterprise could look like. Once you have an idea or a few ideas, you'll then go through a session of road testing your idea, testing it for demand, making sure that it's viable in your community. And then you'll end the accelerator by really formulating what your most next faithful steps are towards building this social enterprise and really putting that plan on a page. There are 7 videos in total, and so the videos are just a component of the accelerator, but it's all meant to be housed together. Shannon, I know that sometimes some churches are wondering whether or not they're the right candidate to start the Good Futures Accelerator. Could you tell us a little bit about who this accelerator is for and who it might not be for?
Yeah, thanks, Tito. Honestly, we believe Good Futures can work for any church, like urban, rural, big or small, evangelical or mainline, because it's a process that helps you ask the right questions, be in conversation together, explore your community. And really, we do believe that there's agency to do this in every congregation. However, there are attributes that we have found that if a church has these attributes, which I'm going to list in a moment, they're going to be able to get the most impact from the accelerator. So one of those attributes is significance. This work has to be important for the congregation. It has to matter. Like, we have to know that we are looking to discover a new way to fulfill our mission in our community. So it has to be significant. There also has to be some capacity. If you can't imagine gathering 2 or 3 other people with you to get a team of 3 to 5 to do this work over a period of time, then that you're going to struggle. So now we have seen groups change. So we have a story of a church that their team kind of passed the baton, but they they kept going. So, but if you can't give it some time or think people are going to gather to have these conversations, then you'll struggle. A third attribute that we found is essential is imagination. And really what we think about there is not the imagination of what will be, but an openness that things might look and be different in the future. So if you're willing to think about opening up your land and your building use in new and unconventional ways, man, this is just so right for you. And then leadership and decisiveness. That's another core attribute. Does your church have the ability to make decisions? Do you have some leadership that's going to drive things forward? So that kind of ability to make decisions and to move forward, that's an attribute that will really help you use Good Futures to the best of your ability, and really to get the most out of it. Another attribute is you really need to be in a discernment phase. If you've already launched a social enterprise or you've already started a development project and you've like broken ground, this really isn't the work for you. It will lead you to question what you're doing instead of keep moving forward. So you really need to be at the big thinking about what's next. You can have some ideas about what that's going to look like, but if you've already started the business or started development, then we'd say this probably isn't the best tool for you. There are two more attributes I want to list, and one is to have a spirit of collaboration. Really, we believe that this work leads churches to work with others. It demands it, that you need to have an openness and a willingness to work with groups outside of the congregation. Now, this process is a process for your congregation, but as you begin to discover what's going on in the community and begin to start a social enterprise, you're going to end up working with others. And so we really find that having a spirit of collaboration is really helpful. And then finally, to have an entrepreneurial mindset. Like Mark said, this whole course is set to do revenue generating activities to fulfill your mission in new ways. If you are anti businesses generating money for church-based activities, you will maybe struggle with this course. But if you're like, actually, this is a tool in our toolkit to fulfill our mission, then this is right for you. So a willingness to create and experiment with mission-aligned income-generating activities is really helpful to be able to get the most from Good Futures.
Thank you, Shannon. That's really helpful context, I think, even for me to understand. And also to your first part, knowing that just about any church can do the Good Futures Accelerator, but these qualities definitely help churches get that next step forward. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and we do have stories of churches that have been under 20 people who, we didn't know who's going to be able to excel. And they have, small churches have been great. Urban churches, people think this work only happens in urban context, but we've seen great stories from rural and suburban context. So yeah, sorry, Tito. I just thought I should say that we have stories from all those different types of churches.
Yeah, no, and that's the perfect segue also. So Mark Sampson, I know that you've worked a lot with our churches in the past. Could you share some stories about what we've learned so far?
Yeah, so there's a few things we've learned. I mean, the most common question you get in this work, and it comes up sometimes in the first 30 seconds, is, well, what about taxes? All right. So and of course, by signing up for this webinar, you got access to one of our resources that helps answer this question. Will generating revenue make us lose our tax exempt status with the IRS? Will it change property taxes locally? What about the state? What about sales tax and all this other stuff? And of course, I'm from England, so I can say this: America is gifted with a complicated tax system. But I would like to say this: your fears are probably much higher than the reality, number one. Number two, we can find out the answers to any of your questions. And there are ways you can solve things that come up. So you're going to need to talk to people at some point. And number 3, let us never let tax be a reason we don't do something missional. All right. We can figure it out. So just don't let it stop you. And there's going to be someone in your church that's terrified about this. So, but, you know, get some folk around that have some expertise, CPAs and lawyers and others at some point later down the journey, not early on. But trust me, these fears tend to be way higher than the reality. And let us not let it stop you. So 1, taxes. Number 2, Shannon touched on this, partnerships. So as churches, we're used to being internally resourced, right? To respond to any kind of opportunity, idea, or challenge. So we have, what do? We have volunteer hours. We can raise a bit of money, perhaps. And with those things and some kind of, and prayer, we kind of get going and we see amazing things happen. I think the future is going to be much more about drawing also on external as well as internal, about forming partnerships. And that's one of the biggest things we learned during the pilot, that churches don't often naturally think of partnerships as a way of getting things done. So one church we were talking to, they were kind of looking around the team that, you know, that was going through Good Futures. And they were asking each other, okay, which one of us is going to have to become the property manager? You know, and we were like, because it related to their project, they were going to do quite a lot of rental space for their project. And I was like, oh my goodness, you know, you don't have to do that. And they were looking at me saying, oh, what do you mean? And I was like, well, there's property management companies out there. Why don't you go talk to them? Find one that's values aligned, that's local, that you trust, and you know, work with them. Work with a developer if you're going to do a development project. One really great example from the pilot, there was a church that sat on a nice chunk of land, and it was next to a university behind it, a healthcare system on the other side. And they began just in their I Spy stuff, talking to these key stakeholders in their neighborhood. And they began to realize there was a problem that everybody cared about. And it was the kind of welfare and well-being of students who became pregnant during their studies, during their undergraduate degrees. And how for the vast majority of the students, it meant they ended up dropping out. And even if they didn't drop out, they just had a very, very challenging, difficult, unsupported time. And so the church is exploring building supportive housing in partnership with the university that's even going to help them raise some money. The healthcare system are absolutely delighted by this because they see this as the need. And they even found a nonprofit that specializes in the wraparound support and care. So this project is going to be the result of 4 partners all working together to create a new development, so a new building that's going to respond to a need. And it just fits with the hospitality and the values of caring for those that are in need that the church has. And so it works across the board. So that's a small example of how partnerships are a key for this work being done. Other things that we've learned from the pilot and from the early, you know, there's about 50 churches since this was launched in just in the beginning of this year that have already started their journey, that we're learning that that really you have what you need. Like, it's a kind of sense of, like, so often, especially if our congregation is shrinking and if our economic challenges are high on our mind, if there's deferred maintenance on our property, we're so used to seeing what's wrong or what's not there, what's missing. But what we're realizing is that churches, it's almost like that change in mentality. Oh my goodness, we actually have so much. Like we you know, do we really believe that we have all we need, right, to you know, to start? And with particularly in different faith traditions, their sense of being called, their sense of you know, the different Christian traditions and how they navigate those questions are exploring, okay, this is possible. A new and different future is possible. And so we're really beginning to see that increasing confidence and perspective early on in the process, which then makes so much happen sort of further down the road.
Thanks, Mark. And now in just a moment, we're going to move on to our Q&A session. And so for that session, we're going to be using the chat function. So if there are any questions that have been on your mind, I know some folks have already been using it, feel free to type those into the chat box here in Zoom. And my colleague Angela will help compile those for us. But before we get to that, I'd like to turn it over to Shannon, who can tell us a little bit about how you all can start the Accelerator.
Yeah, thanks, Tito. By the way, I'm fascinated. Thank you. Please keep putting your comments and questions in the chat. I've been trying to respond, and we'll get to them all, I promise. Okay, so there are a couple of ways that churches can access the Accelerator. So an individual church can go to RootedGood /Good Futures and buy the Accelerator. $795, you get a 15% discount for coming. Oh, wait, I think I got that wrong. $750. Sorry, $750 and a 15% off, because you'll get a code at the end of this. You can buy it, the box comes to you, and you can start going. Now, we also have a group of kind of a bulk purchase. We have two ways to do this. We have a cohort in a box. So if you are in a denomination or a network of churches, or if you work with a lot of churches, you can get the cohort in a box. And basically, as the cohort facilitator, you get a box and you get a host guide, like a cohort host guide. And then you get 8 codes for congregations, and you can run the cohort synchronously or asynchronously, meaning you can get all the churches together all at once, or each church can go at their own pace and you just can bring them together. And we've seen that happen. We've seen cohorts run both ways, and we really are excited about how that works. We also, if you are a large denomination or institution and you think, well, we have hundreds of churches that we want to do this with, then we do have a special license relationship that you can contact us about. But in terms of doing it today, you can just sign up, the box will be with you, and you can get going literally right after Easter.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shannon. So now I'm going to open up to some Q&A. I know some folks here probably have some questions that you're coming into this meeting session with. I'm going to look over to the chat in just a second, and then I'm also going to pull up Shannon and Mark, who can help me answer some of your questions. So just give me one moment. So a few questions have already been answered in the chat, but just for the sake of the recording, I'll go ahead and reiterate some of them, just so that the folks that aren't able to join us today can hear what we've said. So we had one question come up about how long each of the videos are. And so each of the videos tend to vary from session to session. There is a video for each of the 7 sessions, and so each session begins with that. And these videos can range between 10 to 40 minutes, but on average are around 20 minutes. The accelerator length can last, we estimate, around 7 to 9 months. And that's based on congregations meeting once a month for the group session. Each group session themselves lasts approximately 2 hours. We have another question around here. So my congregation is torn between renovation and additions to our worship space, which are needed, versus affordable housing. Would our materials help discern which path or combination to go? So Shannon, thank you for answering in the chat. If you wanted to elaborate just a little bit.
Yeah, Mark was about to jump in. Yeah, I mean, interestingly, so this process will help you discern what's the right next step for your congregation. Now, it may not say affordable housing is the way, or renovating the sanctuary. It may lead you to something completely different. And so that's why it's a process that really helps you discern the next step. We've had a lot of people that think, oh, we know we're going to do this, but then going through the process, they came to a completely different idea. So I don't know, Mark, you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I think, yeah, I mean, our approach is, as Shannon just mentioned, some folk are responding to this opportunity or challenge around church property with a kind of solutions-based approach, and that can be great. So for example, affordable housing is something that in many communities is needed. There are financial models to make that work. It can generate revenue and do all sorts of things. I mean, the interest rates have made that slightly more challenging, but there's still ways you can do that. We really prefer sort of more of a process that can lead to any number of different ways you can respond. And we also are really interested in opening up imagination about what's possible, because often we think there's either ors, you know, when actually there's often both ands. Like buildings and land can be used in multiple ways. You know, affordable housing can be built on top of a multi-use space underneath. There's all sorts of ways we can do things that aren't as sort of binary as sometimes we think the choices are. So just as an example of some of the range of ideas, we tell different stories in the sort of Good Futures workbook at the beginning. You know, one's about this really exciting cafe in a church in South Charleston. Another's about just a really creative use of a parking lot for a chili and beer festival that a church runs, which has been a revenue generator for them and been a real interesting connection point. I really like that one. There's been one about a bike works, you know, repair place created in the basement of a church. It's now been so successful, it's had to move out into bigger spaces. There's one about just, yeah, a renewed form of doing a clothing business rooted in a church, kind of like a way of transforming the kind of some of the older models around donation to more of a sort of business model there. And then another one that, yeah, started enterprise to employ people. So there's all sorts of models, and we tell stories as well in the videos from our own experience. And so just to say, like, there's a lot that could happen, but really how you choose, we feel, needs to be rooted in who you are, right? Like, what's your story? What's your identity as a congregation? It needs to be rooted in where you are, right? Like, what's happening in your community? And this is both in terms of the need you want to respond to, but also very practically, if you're going to be generating some revenue, then there's got to be some demand. Somebody's going to want to pay for something. So you got to figure that one out. And so it's not just who you are, where you are, but it's also what you have. Like, what do you have? What are parts of the building stand? And as you go through this process, some ideas will fade away, right? Because it's like, oh gosh, that's not quite connected with us, or there's not really the need there. But then others will just come from that process to sort of be really plausible and possible in front of you. So we really believe, even if you end up where you are, where you think you might get to, right? Then the process itself will build confidence. It will build alignment and agreement. So wherever you get, we believe this can have sort of real value.
Great. And then I think a good follow-up question to that, Mark, that we just got in the chat. Are the streams of revenue segment intended to generate an enterprise idea? Or does it allow for approaches to pursuing philanthropy? Do all of our success stories include enterprise? And is this accelerator helpful outside?
Okay, excellent question. Whoever asked that we need to come up with a prize for that question. So that helps us unpack social enterprise. So social enterprise, because you're using sort of revenue generating approaches, but you're doing so normally in places and spaces where it's absent, right? Like you're trying to meet a need, you're working with a community, you're trying to solve some real community tension around an issue, that often in those spaces you do need other forms of support and help as well. So the most common business model is a kind of blended one. So when I talk about revenue generating, I don't mean like that it brings in extraordinary amounts of money. This is not Apple or Tesla, right? Or Amazon. It's just as part of what you do, you're generating some revenue as well, but probably there'll be some other forms of income as well alongside that. So what we've seen is these new projects have also attracted local philanthropy. Community foundations are getting really interested in some of this stuff, working with churches. And other people might want to give to this that might not want to, that might not normally be attracted to giving to congregations as such. And often, often there'll be some volunteer time still from people in your church or the wider community. So there's all sorts of ingredients that are part of the bigger sort of financial model of these projects, if you like. And really what we're focusing on in that is kind of emphasizing the one that we're often not, it's the muscle that we're not used to exercising, right? Which is this sort of revenue generating one. But it's not a kind of either or. It's then normally some sort of mix or approach, if that helps you.
I think I just want to reiterate, the other thing is it's not just income generation for income generation's sake. It's not just business for the sake of doing something new. It's not newness for the sake of doing something new. It really is about putting mission first. How do we fulfill our mission, and how do we align money and mission in new ways? So
yeah, thank you both. Another great question in the chat, which I know the answer to, but Mark, I'm going to let you take this one on since we just talked about it recently. Does the Accelerator curriculum include advice and process to assess potential competition from existing nonprofits or for-profit businesses? There's lots of talk about opening coffee shops, cafes, to know in advance the competition is fierce. Yeah, how does the Accelerator help with that?
Yeah, so yeah, so there's two ways to answer that question, right? And this is the new bit. So I think there's some folk on this call that actually were part of the pilot, so they could tell you some of the stories. But there's some new content we added since then, which is session 6, which is all about testing for demand. So not just, so our biggest concern with working with churches and faith-based organizations, and sometimes even the entire nonprofit community, is a kind of build it and they will come approach. Like just the idea alone is good because we came up with it. So let's do it and then see if it works. And for us, that's just rarely a good idea unless you're kind of Kevin Costner in a baseball field somewhere. So if you're not, and I'm guessing you aren't, then don't do that. And so instead, what we need to do is test all of our assumptions. Okay, we like hospitality. Why don't we start a cafe? Okay, then we got to figure out, is there demand for a cafe where we are, right? Like if there's 6 cafes within kind of a mile of you, that doesn't actually mean it's a problem. What you need to know is, how are they doing? Are they full? Are they too full? What's the demographic like? How's that demographic changing over time? What's the average spend at a coffee shop in 2024? You can find out all this stuff. How is that changing? And then you talk to people that have lived there for 30 years, and they'll be like, oh my gosh, there's 6 cafes now, but there used to be 10. And they're like, oh dear, okay. Or like there's 6 now, but there used to be 2. And what? And then so understanding and unpacking is the road to go. So really testing for demand, and we love to get people experimenting super quickly about that. You don't have to wait till you've got the final thing. You can just do some pop-up stuff. You can do some experiments. You can do an evening at your church that does a tiny bit of the thing you're trying to explore. So there's all sorts of ways. Yeah, you can test for that. For sure, if you're starting to do something in a different way as a church, it's going to involve different kinds of relationships with folk in your community. You want to be thinking about that. You want to really be thinking about that. We do, but we know, and as part of our community listening and exploration piece, we're very keen to help churches avoid just simply repeating something that's already happening, right? Like don't if something great is happening, then go talk to them about working together. Don't just create a slightly less good version.
Love that. Well, I think that's, for now, that's all the questions in the chat. If people have more questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. We still have some time. If folks would prefer to speak out a question, the best way to do that, so in Zoom, on that toolbar where you have, there's a reactions button. If you want to use the raise hand function, if you have a question you'd like to speak about, feel free to use that, and then we can use some time for that.
I would just say quickly, one other story I had recently, which I'm quite excited about because it's in a rural context. And lots of the stories that you often hear about this work in a more urban context is there's a church in Florida that was in the midst of a number of a kind of real a horse riding type community. I mean, I don't really have the equine language to describe that accurately, but and they had a good chunk of land like outside their building, and they realized it was big enough to host a kind of one of these sort of horse festivals that happen annually. And so they started reaching out and talking to folk, and they now essentially generate sufficient revenue to meet their shortfall every year from one annual event, and where they welcome thousands of people onto their land to have this sort of festival together. But the definition is, it's not just achieved that financially, but it's created entirely new connections, entirely new ways of them functioning as a kind of chaplain to this broader movement that's happening locally. So it's repositioning themselves financially, it's using their land in new ways, and I think crucially, it's creating totally new possibilities for their witness as a congregation. And so that's a lovely sort of example of those three things which we're hoping to see happen through this stuff.
Thank you, Mark.
I have a practical, just came in a direct question to me. The 15% off discount code that we're offering is going to be good through the end of April, and it's also good for cohorts, for the cohort model, as well as for individual churches.
So there's a great question just came in about whether churches go through the accelerator and do not come up with a social enterprise. Yes, for sure. And so there's a couple of stories here. One fascinating story was the church was going through it. They're super excited by it. And they got to the community listening piece. So this would be session early on, I think it's session 3. And they went out and did a bunch of walking the I Spy in their neighborhood. And they just had this moment of realization that they were completely disconnected from their community. You know, it's a common story. It's an older congregation in a neighborhood that has changed demographically in the last 30 years significantly. And they had no connections. And they kind of felt led to stop and say, okay, we need to build bridges before we can cross them. We need to actually pay attention to what's the disconnect we have and not come up with an idea, because how could, for them, they were saying, how could we come up with an idea that helps when we don't even know the people to whom it's trying to help? And so they paused. And as far as we know, they've been paused there for quite a long time now, just building connections. They said they're going to sign up to every community group, attend every event, and crucially, not say anything, just listen. Just start building connections, building relationships. So they paused, you know, they paused in their journey. We have had congregations that, for lots of reasons, you know, particularly during COVID and the sort of challenges faced around just the urgency of responding to those needs, that paused their process as well. So it's not, you know, it's something that you know, it's not a kind of, you know, guaranteed thing. It's a journey, it's a pathway. And as you go further down the pathway, you begin making sort of key decisions. And sometimes, you know, we've had churches realize that, you know, maybe actually they need to do something else, you know, and so thinking about coming towards, you know, the end of this chapter as opposed to the beginning of a new one. And so there's all sorts of ways people can come through this, but we've been delighted with how many have actually come through and actually started something that they feel really excited about.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Another good question that came through the chat is, are there scholarships for small membership churches? And so I can just quickly answer that, and Mark and Shannon, feel free to follow up on that. So right now we do offer the Accelerator to individual churches for $750. It's a one-time fee that gives you all of the materials for your church to complete the Accelerator. We do occasionally have some discounts or deals that go on. So one popularly that goes around is this 15% off deal that you will all be receiving after this webinar. In addition to that, we do offer packages. So if a congregation is part of a group of churches, part of our cohort in a box package, that does offer a discounted rate for churches participating in that cohort, with a sponsoring institution paying for that that cohort fee. The other way that churches can get discounted membership or access to the Accelerator is through our licensing offering. And so that's often for larger institutions, middle judicatories, denominational institutions that purchase a license to use our materials to then share with churches in their institution. So right now we're working on a license with PCUSA. So PCUSA churches can get a discounted rate on our accelerator. So if you belong to a PCUSA congregation and you're interested in more information on that, feel free to reach out to us. We can give you more information on that. Yeah, but Mark or Shannon, do you have anything to add?
No, well, I think the cohort in a box, just to say, is for the individual church, that makes it 50% off. So for the individual church, but the fee for the cohort in a box is $3,500, and then we're giving the 15% off for that. So if you're part of a group, and we have had churches say, let's get other churches to do it together. So that's another way to do that.
We just had a great question come in about whether we have adapted our materials for a Canadian context. So we are talking about that, and we've had quite a few folk reach out for that, and we're trying to currently explore what that might mean. Canada is fascinatingly similar and yet somewhat different to the operating environment in the US, and there's stuff that would be similarly across, and there's stuff that would be different. There's also the question of obviously translation into French. And we are exploring a few different ways that the course could grow into the future. And interestingly, Canada has some amazing stories about this work. Like there's some fascinating stuff that's just been done, particularly around some of Carla Longhurst's work around franchising home care opportunities for churches, so they can help elderly people age in place and generate revenue whilst doing so. And that's been a real success story and a different way of doing this, which we love. So stay in touch, keep bugging us if you haven't heard any Canadian specific things in the next while.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Mark and Shannon, for answering some of our questions. And folks, if there are still questions lingering on your mind, know that this doesn't have to be the only chance to get those answered. You're more than welcome to email us at info@rootedgood.org or goodfutures@rootedgood.org. We'll see your message either way. But thank you all so much for joining us for today's webinar. As a thank you for joining us and being interested in the accelerator, we are offering this 15% discount code on the accelerator purchase. So you can use the code SPRING15 at purchase. If you have any issues using your code or accessing the purchase page, again, feel free to email us and we can help you walk through that. And this is good until April 30th. But that is all we have for you today. Thank you again so much. And we will be emailing you this recording in case you'd like to share it with anyone else. Bye.